Kia ora. Where do you store random objects of potential practicality? The batteries, plasters and paper clips you accumulate in life. This podcast is pretty much that place. You have opened the audio drawer. Here we're hoarding recordings for New Zealand Baptists, because one day this episode could be just the thing. What does the Bible have to say about our function as elders? What is it that we are meant to be and do? Charles Hewlett talks to George Whelan, Director of Mission Research and Training at Carey Baptist College, about the Bible and eldership. Previously, George has taught New Testament at Carey, has been a Baptist pastor in the United Kingdom, and a missionary in Brazil. Find additional resources, including discussion questions, at lifelonglearning.nz/elders. This recording is from the Better Church Elders video series. Thanks to the Carey Centre for Lifelong Learning for producing this free resource.
George, it's very nice to be able to talk with you today around the topic of the Bible and eldership. Maybe we could just start with you reflecting with us. What does the Bible actually say about eldership?
An interesting question, because in terms of what does it say, we're going to ask, what does it describe, what does it reflect, as well as what guidance might it give? And what it reflects is patterns of community leadership in Israel and then in the early days of the church. And so the question of the Bible and eldership is partly a question on whether we regard everything that we read as prescriptive, or whether we recognize that some or much is descriptive, which requires a further step to be asking, how do we derive from that guidance for us? I think that one of the intriguing things that I find is that I read the Bible differently according to what real communities I'm picturing when I read it. For example, in my home church in Leeds in England, where I became a member at the age of 13, and that was the very, very traditional working class nonconformist church in the north of England. And the model of leadership was really what was learned in the trade unions. And so none of our leaders had been to university. It wasn't that sort of academic church, but they'd cut their teeth in local organisation and community. And so that's how it functioned as a leadership. It was largely reactive, responsive, look after the members, take care of things, deal with issues that come up, make decisions about what is right for this group. And the pastor was, I don't know if he was the foreman or the shop steward, but he has, had a specific role, and then the others were working well with the pastor. I then moved to train for ministry to London, culturally very, very different, and was placed in a more middle-class church. And that was my first experience of leadership within a community of business people. And that's how it functioned. It wasn't like the trade union committee meeting. It was much more like the boardroom. And it functioned differently, and there were different expectations, and there was an agenda, and there was goal setting, and deciding how you would measure success and all of those things. And people were there for their specific skills in different areas of the finance and the planning and the strategizing and so on. Completely different. And so I began to think, which one's right? I began to realize, no, this is just actually how leadership functions naturally in these different communities. And then I go to the Bible and find not a template that fits either of those, but the way leadership functioned organically within the communities that are described there. And that's where you get elders first appearing. And the elder, well, the word for elder in Greek is presbyteros, which just means an old person. And the elders were, on the whole, people with more life experience and standing and respect within the community. not so much in terms of specific functions, but in terms of the standing that they held, which enabled them to function as the guardians of that community's identity and its life. And out of that function as holders, guardians of the community's identity, came a teaching role, came a guiding role, a mentoring role, a modeling role, a place in the decision making, but always decision making as influence from within, not as dictatorship from above. And when you look at traditional societies across the world and through history, they've always had elders. They've always had those people who have seniority. And fortunately for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've got a living traditional society right here in Te Ao Māori. And I found it helpful to think of elders in the way that Māori communities think of their kaumātua. And I asked one once, how do you get to be a kaumātua? Do you get elected? No. Do you do a course? No. Says, what happens? Says, well, what happened? And he considered himself too young to be a kaumātua. But he said it's just when the community basically looks in your direction and says, you're up. You know, we give you this role. We give you this function. You're the one who's going to speak for us now. You need to step up. And so often it's just through age, but at times it can be someone whose particular gift to that community and who inhabits the identity of that community is recognized as having that mana, even when they're younger than would normally be the case.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question around who can be an elder then, you know, and we are a very diverse society, gender, different ethnicities, ages. Who can be an elder, do you think?
Well, in terms of communities, how communities function, it varies dramatically from one to another in terms of their protocols, their expectations, their ideas. When we look at the Bible, we see that reflected. The elders in the Gospels are the Jewish elders that we come across, and they're all male. The elders that we see mentioned in the New Testament, the book of Acts, as elders are appointed in churches, in the letters of Paul and of Peter, of John, again, it seems they're male. So the question in terms of using the Bible in determining our practice is, again, is this descriptive of how things functioned at that time? And so the question is not, elders must be male. The question is, your elders, who presumably in your society are male, ought to be people of this character and this standing. Or is it prescriptive, just like Jesus had male apostles, and so leaders are male and there are male elders, so eldership is male. And I think that has to be determined within communities according to how leadership functions within that community. But in communities where both women and men exercise leadership naturally in different ways, then I see that as covered by these patterns in Scripture of the pools of people from whom those who are suitable for the particular responsibilities within the church community are drawn. I would say that they're usually local. You do get in the New Testament trans-local ministry, but these folk don't seem to be the elders. An exception might be Peter, who describes himself as an elder, and he's clearly ministering across a wide range. But for the most part, the elders are local, and the trans-local ministers are your apostles and missionaries and troubleshooters and teachers and prophets that go from place to place. So you get this notion of fairly small communities of faith, which have within them this appropriate local leadership. And then you get the ministry that is trans-local and that also connects the different groups together in the network.
I mean, you started to you answer this a little bit, but some of the tasks or the things that these local elders were performing.
That's interesting. We encounter them in the Gospels largely in their role as leaders of the community. So that they're in the council along with the priests and scribes and other people with standing and with a contribution to make. In the New Testament churches, it's interesting to look at what terms are used together. So the term for elder, presbyteros, that's used a number of times. But then often you get in the same statement that term plus other terms. So Paul, for example, Acts chapter 20, he talks to the elders of the church in Ephesus, and he tells them about his role, and he says to them, now, you're elders, you're presbyteroi, and so you have to tend the flock, which is the pastor role. Mm-hmm. The flock over which you've been made overseers, episkopoi. So there's 3 terms that are referring to the same people. So it's not so much a hierarchy in which one's in charge, which one's superior, inferior, or whatever. It's that these are ways of talking about this function, this generic function of leadership. And so the leadership, and the umbrella term is elders, the senior people. The senior people are caring for others. They're pastoring. Yeah. The senior people are overseeing, they're managing the affairs of that community, looking after its life. And those ideas come through the pastoral and the practical. Yeah. And it's the same people, yeah. The elders who are doing that.
Because we hear the term, use the word governance a lot. Yes. Yeah. So was that something that they would have been doing?
I don't think they'd have given it a thought, frankly, in that way. This is what I mean by saying that leadership takes particular forms in particular cultures. And in modern industrial and post-industrial societies, notions of governance and executive authority and function and so on have become very, very important, because that's how people intuitively organize themselves. Mm. Who's got this responsibility, and who makes decisions about it, and who does it and makes sure that it happens, and there's a separation. I think when we try and superimpose that in the New Testament, it just doesn't work, because that's not the way that people functioned. And nor is it the way that people in practice actually live their lives. You know, you don't split yourself up into the decision-making aspect and the doing aspect. They're more integrated. What you get is the embodying of that which is right, decision-making coming out of that, and the enacting of that which is seen and known and felt to be right for the community. So I'm afraid, I'm not going to say the Bible's not much use there. I'm going to say that the questions we ask of the Bible have to be appropriate to what the Bible is willing to tell us about.
Yeah. So, is a difference between a pastor and an elder?
This is a particular problem for Baptists, because historically, you could say that the pastor is simply the Protestant priest. Again, you know, in a particular society, there's an expectation of a special role. I found this, I was missionary in Brazil for some time, and there was a strong expectation that the religious leader has all these priestly functions. Now, those who became evangelical believers said, we do things differently now. But in practice, you could see that the expectation was that the person who had the title pastor was actually in the role that the priest was in the traditional Catholicism, has the mystical ability to kind of mediate God to them, has the authority to exercise leadership and so on. When it comes to looking at the pastoral function in the New Testament, we don't really see pastoring as a separate job, but the elders are told to pastor. And then the image of the pastor, the metaphor of the shepherd, is used more generally of care for others. So yes, Baptists who search the scriptures to find the Baptist pastor in the pages there do struggle a bit. because as I've mentioned, Paul says to the elders, you pastor the flock. Yeah. Peter says, I'm a fellow elder with you, so take care of the flock that we've been trusted with. So I think pastoring is one of the ways in which elders fulfill their function. It may well be that a community such as a church decides to give specific responsibilities to one or more people. I think that it's maybe not the most helpful to say that the pastoral function is given to those people. They do have responsibility within it. But in terms of a person who has a particular function for the life and management of the community, that's more the episkopos, or the kind of household manager. And just while I'm on that, there's one verse that in some English translation seems to suggest that the elders rule, which is in 1 Timothy 5, those who rule well in some translations. The word there for rule, proistemi, is actually rarely used of ruling in the sense of being the one in charge or the one who is giving orders. It's used often of the household manager, the servant who has a particular responsibility for organizing things, for people who generally have responsibilities that they fulfill well, that do involve organization, leadership, and so on. So a better translation there is that those elders who play a significant role and do a good job in the management of the church, of the community, are to be especially respected.
George, you know the New Testament well. Can you think of an example of an eldership group that functioned well, and what was it about them?
Evidence is not explicit. Where we see the council of elders, it's in terms of commissioning. You know, Timothy, Paul says to Timothy that he was prayed for by the council of elders. So there's commissioning on behalf of the whole church. We do see groups, they're just not necessarily called elders. Right. Sometimes other names. So in the most general sense, yes, these are elders, they're people with standing and mana in the community. But it's not so much set out in terms of they're doing this because this is their function. I'll give you one if you like, which is not an elder group specifically, but it is a group of people that we can aspire to in terms of their ministry and their service for the church. I'm talking about Acts chapter 13 in the church in Antioch. And that was an interesting one because it was both a mission church in a new context, and it was a continuing of a part of the Jerusalem church that had been scattered through persecution. Just in passing and in the way into this, we find that one of the first things that is done in the mission of Paul and the others is the finding and identifying people who can take the role of elder. And we don't know whether it was one for a group or whether it was several. The suggestion is it's several rather than one for each, always a group. But this was crucial just for the sociological function that a group needs some degree of coherence. And in days before, there were written scriptures available, never mind internet and other resources. It was the people who held the tradition, who were the holders of knowledge and transmitted it faithfully, and that's where the teaching and modelling function comes in so well. But a group, chapter 13 of Acts. Now in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a member of the court of Herod the ruler, and Saul. And while they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them." Then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. And there's one about the content of that group, another about particular aspects of its function. And the function that we see is worshipping, praying, fasting together, being attentive to God together for God's purpose, not only for that church in Antioch, but for the world. And then able to respond to God in the very costly way of giving away 2 of their own number for wider work. So that's the thing. But what about the content of them? This is the thing that I find so thrilling and resonates so strongly with the churches in New Zealand today. Who were these people? Barnabas. Well, he was a bicultural person. He was a Cypriot, but a Jew respected in Jerusalem. So he'd come from Cyprus. He was a person of wealth and property. He'd respected by the folk in Jerusalem. He was clearly one of the very early believers who came to hold the respect of the Jerusalem church. So he is sent as a translocal person to come and see what's happening in Antioch and be the representative of the Jerusalem church there. So a Cypriot Jew who has lived in various places, moved around the world. Simeon called Niger. Niger is just the Greek word for black. So this is black Simeon, an African. And he, like many in the mixed population of the Mediterranean, had ended up in Antioch. So already we're sensing that there's an ethnic diversity there. Then Lucius of Cyrene. Cyrene is round about where Libya is today, another North African. Manaen, member of the court of Herod the ruler. So he was part of that household. Herod, the sort of half-Jewish pretender to the Jewish throne, in with the Romans. And then there was Saul, who was a diaspora Jew of Tarsus, sent to Jerusalem to train, and then encountered Jesus, and his life and the life of the world has never been the same since. So the thing that really strikes me there is that this is a group of incredible diversity. And how they got on together, well, I mean, I don't know. What barriers did they have to overcome in terms of background, tradition, even linguistic issues? But united in their faith in Christ, in their delight in the life of the risen Jesus, and energized by the Spirit, serving the church, and then brought together to seek the Lord. I think that if you ask, why was Antioch the most effective mission-sending church in the New Testament, possibly in history? Maybe you weren't asking that, but just say you were to ask that. I would gladly answer. Partly, it's because they had such a diverse group of ministers and leaders. And is it any surprise that it's this group, rather than the group in Jerusalem, that is able to hear God's heart for the whole world and is willing to surrender some of their wealth and treasure in Barnabas and Saul for that wider work. So I don't want to be prescriptive unnecessarily, but let me just say, if there's one thing I could say to to folk who are thinking about this and thinking about their elders group, their leaders group, whatever they're calling them, is how diverse are you? And I'm not talking about being representative. It's not divide your congregation. If you're 15% Chinese, then have 1.5 Chinese people in your leadership. It's not like that. What I'm saying is, do you want to hear God's heart for the world? Then bring people together who listen from different parts of that world and different sets of experiences. And as you listen together, inevitably the horizon stretches ahead of you.
Oh, thanks for your time today, George. It's been very good for us to have talked with you.
It's a great conversation, Charles, and I'm just excited to hear about some of the conversations that happen around the country about this really important topic.